So I will try to be brief. So my name is Juha Honkaniemi, and as introduced, I work as a researcher at Natural Resources Institute Finland, Luke in Helsinki. And I work with simulation modeling, forest disturbances, disturbance dynamics, and how to take those disturbance risks into account when planning future forest management measures. And I want to thank for the invitation for today's workshop and have you a short presentation about our work at Luke. So my topic today will be simulating forest disturbances and their impacts on forests in a changing world. Quite broad topic, but we'll try to narrow it a bit down now. Let's start. What are natural disturbance dynamics? So by definition, disturbances are, or disturbance is a discrete event in time and space that are temporarily reducing the living plant biomass. A good example you can see in the background photo here. It's a forest fire from in 1990s in southern Finland in a conservation area. You can see that the old tree generation was almost completely burned, reducing the living plant biomass. But that's just a temporary, or the biomass has been reduced only temporarily, and new tree generation is already growing. And different kind of disturbance events can happen within the same area over time, and together they form the natural disturbance dynamics. And it's important to remember that these disturbance dynamics are a natural part of forest succession. And once we set a certain value for a forest, for example, an economic value for timber, we can call and talk about different damages. So what kind of impacts these different natural disturbances then cause in forests? They can be either positive, neutral, or negative. And in general, the positive effects are related to changes in albedo, as well as usually more positive effects and impacts on biodiversity. Whereas then if we look at, for example, other ecosystem services such as timber primary production or carbon storage, the disturbance impacts are then most often negative. My title mentioned the climate change, and that's also in the topic of many talks today and tomorrow. How disturbances are then affected by climate change. And we did a literature review a few years ago and identified 3 different potential pathways. First of all, there are direct effects. For example, with the climate change, windiness increases and the lack of ground frost increases, which will lead to increased wind disturbances. Or that we have a temperature increase, which means that the insects are having enhanced living conditions. There are indirect effects. For example, that the decreased precipitation leads to tree species diversity, or changes in tree species diversity and composition, which will emerge new disturbance regimes. And finally, we have interaction effects. For example, increased wind disturbances due to climate change will lead to increased bark beetle disturbances. And in our review, we found that these direct effects are the major pathway for climate change to impact different disturbance agents. In every other case, except for insects, where we have much more equally distributed, or where the impact pathways are more equally distributed between the direct, indirect, and interaction effects. My background is in forest pathology. So for me, from my studies, disease triangle is something I learned early on. And I've tried to understand also the whole concept of disturbance dynamics with that disease triangle. So if we consider disturbance dynamics in general, we will require the agent, whether that's a biotic or abiotic, and that agent will be should have a host to have an impact, and both of them will be affected by the surrounding environment. And this is something where we are also, or how we should see the modeling of different disturbances. So we need to incorporate all the aspects, not only the agent, but the host and environment as well. Good example of that is the bark beetle populations and what kind of different drivers are affecting bark beetles, and what we should take into account when we are creating simulation models for bark beetles. First of all, here we can see that the warming climate and the changing climate is a big driver for bark beetles. It has this direct effect on bark beetle populations, increased reproduction with warming climate, but it has also the interaction effect through the wind events. So wind events increase, and that will have a positive effect on bark beetle populations. As well as, just as we just heard, increased drought events will make the trees more susceptible for bark beetle attacks in the future. Another important aspect is the host. So how, for example, past or different socioeconomic drivers, for example, how past timber prices have affected the tree species composition in Finland or in Fennoscandia or in Europe as a whole, and how that has increased the planting of Norway spruce outside also the natural range. And that has caused positive impacts on bark beetle populations and the current or almost past bark beetle outbreaks in Central Europe, for example. Also important when we are considering different disturbances and simulation modeling are different scales, and that the different scales are crucial to consider. In forest modeling, we've been focusing, in forest management especially, we've been focusing mostly in the past on stand scale. But with the different spatio-temporal correlations between disturbances themselves and between different interactions between different disturbance agents, we need to actually consider quite much larger areas. So we need to move in the spatial scale. In addition, considering the scale of organization, we started in forest management with individual tree species and pure plantations, and we have moved to mixed forests and analyzing the mixed forests or multiple different species growing together, or in spatial scale, for example, in landscapes. But now we need to move to incorporate also other living organisms, not just the tree species, but also, for example, different biotic agents. And in temporal scale, with the climate change, we should be able to move quite fluently from minutes to hours to years, and the changing climate all the way to century scale. So we need to expand the scales of space, time, and organization in our modeling approaches. And what we are doing at Luke to achieve these We are working with a model called Island, the individual-based forest landscape and disturbance model, which is a multi-scaled process-based model. And what that means is that it starts from the grain of individual trees and simulates into extent of forest landscapes. And we have these different processes in the model at different scales. For example, we have tree-level processes of competition, growth, and mortality. And then at stand level, we are simulating some of the processes as production, primary production or environmental responses. And then in landscape level processes, we have disturbances and the disturbance dynamics as well as seed dispersal. And also in Island, it is a process-based model, so we can incorporate also dynamic climate conditions, meaning different climate change scenarios. Island is a well described model, and there is good descriptions of the different model functions in behind islandmodel.org website, as well as a recently published paper on what different capabilities of Island. And as I mentioned, the Island is highly capable of doing different things on simulating the forest vegetation, but we also have these different disturbance modules in there. One for wind, one for bark beetles, one for fire, and a generic one to simulate the effects and impacts of different biotic agents. In addition, there is a management module, which as we start from single trees and know the location of each and every tree in a roughly 30 to 40,000 hectare landscape, we can realistically simulate management starting from single tree harvests to clear cuts. We can also adapt different landscape level planning of different individual agents, meaning in this case, different forest owners. So those are the sort of principles of what to do, and in general, what we need to consider in simulating and modeling different natural disturbances, and in a nutshell, the model that we are using at Luke. An Island is currently used quite widely in Central Europe, in North America, and also recently in Japan. And what we have done with Island, I will showcase few examples from our recent studies with it in Finland. So first of all, let's dive into the question of how are forest disturbance regimes changing in Finland. Here are one figure and a table. How the different impacts of how are the impacts of different disturbances at the moment in Finland. On the left, you can see the damaged areas by agent in Finland based on the NFI 12, published a few years ago. And there we can see that snow damages and ungulate damages, meaning moose, here are the most frequent agents per area, followed by wind, decaying fungi, and so on. And we can see what you're talking about at the most at the workshop is the spruce bark beetle, quite low still here regarding damaged area. But once we move to the economic impacts, we can see that in total, we've estimated the annual costs for different disturbances in Finland to vary from 80 million to 150 million euros per year. And most of that, the biggest agent for that is the heterobasidian root rot on spruce, causing over 50 million euro losses. and followed by moose damages, wind disturbances, snow disturbances, and increasing European spruce bark beetle disturbances. So that is the situation at the moment, and how we are expecting that to change in the future. We've done some simulations in a landscape in southern Finland. It's a typical southern boreal landscape, and simulated business as usual forest management from 2020 to 2100 in 3 different climate change scenarios. First one on the left is the historical climate from 1991 to 2020, resampled for the next 80 years. Then we have a low-end RCP 4.5 scenario, and then the rightmost is a high-end RCP 8.5. Glad to say that that's already not that realistic where we would be heading at the moment. What we can see that with the historical climate or under historical climate, our disturbances in that landscape on average cubic meters per hectare per year are quite low. And with the RCP 4.5 scenario, we would see a bit of increase in the latter part of the century. And in the high-end RCP 8.5, we would see already quite increase, especially for bark beetles. If we compare the disturbed volumes per tree growth, what we can see here, again, historical low-end and high-end climate change scenarios, we can see that the disturbed volumes per growth are relatively low, few percent of the growth under historic climate, and increasing a bit towards the end of the century, which is related, as there is no climate change, this is related more to the changes in composition and structure of the landscape. Then in low end, we will see a little bit of increase by the end of century due to climate change, and in RCP 8.5 scenario, we would should start seeing the increase already in 2050. Interesting in this high-end scenario are these peak years. In 2 peak years, which were mostly a combination of high wind disturbances and also quite dramatic drought events. But eventually, even under high-end RCP 8.5, on average, the disturbances of the disturbed volumes would be around maximum 30% of the total volume per hectare, or per growth, per annual growth. So that's under when things are developing in a normal way. How forests would then recover in future if we face a major disturbance event? And I'm talking now about those spikes or events like those spikes in the RCP 8.5 or even bigger events. If we consider a storm of a century, such happened in Sweden 20 years ago. I think we can call the Gudrun storm of a century if we look at the wind speeds during Gudrun and look at their probabilities from the past data. We know that the probabilities for such wind speeds were roughly around 1%. And Gudrun 20 years ago felled almost the annual harvest of timber in 12 hours. So what we did, we simulated our southern boreal landscape with Gudrun intensity storm, but we wanted to know under climate change, does it matter when this kind of storm of a century happens. So we simulated this storm for either for year 2020 or for year 2050. And then simulated the forest development without forest management, in this case, under low-end RCP 4.5 and the high-end RCP 8.5. And the simulations included other storms as expected, so as I showed you just recently, and also included the different the bark beetle dynamics interacting with these storms. And the simulations were done with island. Here are results regarding bark beetle. So disturbed, the share of disturbed volume of growing stock. So what you can see here in the first columns, so on the first uppermost row, we have the low-end RCP 4.5. On the bottom row, the high-end RCP 8.5. Then on the left column, there is no storm of century occurring during the simulations. So we see that wind in under the low-end scenario, wind disturbances are the most frequent ones, affecting roughly few percent of the growing stock annually. And under 8.5, we see the increase of bark beetle disturbances after 2050. If we then simulated the storm of century for 2020, it causes quite massive impact, reducing almost 20% of the growing stock. But there is not much difference then regarding other following disturbances after that. So there is no big difference between the NOSOC and SOC 2020 scenarios, despite of this one peak in 2020. But things then change when we are going and simulating the storm of a century in 2050. The impacts are a bit higher due to the changes in the structure and composition of the landscape. Under a 4.5 scenario, we don't see much bark beetle outbreak even after this storm of the century. But under 8.5, we're actually seeing quite big outbreak after this huge storm event in 2050. So it does matter when this kind of once in the century type of large-scale disturbances happen in a changing climate. And when they happen in the changing climate might have also interaction effects with other disturbance agents. Did we observe something else? I wanted to measure the changes in structure and composition after storm of a century. And what you can see here is that with storm of century in 2020, the variation in the trajectory of the landscape in terms of Shannon index, here measuring the tree species diversity, increases. And if it happens in 2050, it actually puts the landscape on a new trajectory under 4.5. And then things are developing much more interestingly under 8.5, where we are with the storm in 2050, creating more space for diversity, or tree species diversity. So there is more opportunities with climate change for new tree species, and those can flourish better after in no management conditions after a major storm. A bit same story in regarding structure measured here with basal area. Variation increases a bit with these storms of century being simulated, and the trajectories are a bit different, but in the end they will reach on average in a landscape scale a basal area of roughly 30 to 33 squares per hectare. And the final examples what I wanted to show you today is about the forest management and how we can adapt to changing disturbance regimes. Here in this study, we wanted to compare mitigation-oriented management measures against adaptive management measures. And what that meant is we created 4 different, we had our baseline was the business as usual scenario. And for mitigation scenarios, we wanted to increase the rotation lengths either by 10% or 30%. And also wanted to increase the share of set-aside areas, and especially focus those set-aside areas for the oldest and highest volume stands in the landscape. Whereas in the adaptation scenarios, we wanted to we wanted to adapt to the changing and increasing disturbances and wanted to decrease the rotation lengths either by 10 or 30%, and also created one single area for protection of 50% of the total simulated area. It was one connected area randomly placed in the landscape. And here on the left, you can see that we are located in southwestern Finland with our southern boreal landscape. Still dominated by conifers, mostly Norway spruce, with some pine and birch in the mix. So to compare the mitigation and adaptation scenarios, how that affected different ecosystem services. Well, the mitigation management increases the carbon storage, but as you can see here on the left, again, on the rows, historical climate, low-end climate, and high-end climate. Then on the first column is total carbon in the landscape. And you can see here that the mitigation, the green ones are the mitigation management, and the purple ones are the adaptation management. Mitigation increases carbon storage, and the adaptation reduces the carbon storage compared to business as usual, due to longer rotation with mitigation, shorter rotation with adaptation. If we see the patterns are the same between the different climate change scenarios. Harvests are increasing. The cumulative harvests are increasing with adaptive a bit from the BAU with the adaptive measures. So we have shorter rotations, we are harvesting more, and with longer rotations, we are harvesting less in the mitigation scenarios. And then if we look at the annual disturbances, how much different management regimes are affecting the disturbances, we don't see much differences under historic climate or low-end climate. A bit of increase in the low-end climate change scenario after 2050, especially in the mitigation, but some also in the adaptation scenarios. And under high-end RCP 8.5, we are starting to see more increase. And here, with the longer rotation lengths, we see more disturbances, and the adaptive scenarios are working quite efficiently. They are here on par with the business as usual, but you need to remember that also in the business as usual, we didn't have any conservation areas. And then in the adaptation scenarios, we did have 15% of the area under protection, which means that those disturbances were then mostly focusing on those conservation areas. But here we are calculating the total of the whole landscape. Those carbon and harvest, timber harvest, are only 2 ecosystem services provided by forests. And we wanted to see also a bit of other how these management regimes are affecting other ecosystem services as well. And what we can see here is that, for example, bilberry production was a little bit higher in the adaptive scenarios compared to mitigation scenarios, whereas then large trees, as what we used as a proxy for biodiversity, were more that their amount increased compared to business as usual under mitigation scenarios, where we are growing longer rotations as well as conserving the high volume old stands in the landscape. And the patterns are changing a bit depending on the climate change scenario. But the main patterns are still looking the same. So to conclude my presentation, simulation models, we need detailed process-based models to grasp such complex issues as disturbance dynamics are, especially in a changing climate. And the different spatio-temporal correlations and interactions between different disturbance agents require us to take or move from the more traditional stand level simulations to landscape extent. We know that natural disturbances are increasing in Fennoscandia, but based on our simulations, they could remain low depending on the climate change. As we saw in the low-end climate change scenario, the disturbances are going to or should stay on a low level. However, this kind of large-scale disturbances, as I showed this example of the storm of century, they can set forests for new trajectories and can have remarkable effects in our forests. Regarding forest management choices, they play a significant role in determining how our forests look in the future. We can increase carbon storage despite of the increasing disturbance risks, but this will come with the expense of lower harvest yields. And as the disturbances are increasing with climate change, the main goal in forest management should be on decreasing the effects of climate change on our forests. The future questions, and especially related to this workshop, is how to utilize the increasing and more precise knowledge on the state of the forests with simulation models. So currently we are relying on the static information derived from forests, but how we could develop the simulation models in the future to become more dynamic with the increasing knowledge, for example, based on laser scanning projects. That's all, and I'm hoping to have a few interesting questions. Thank you.